Good evening and welcome to the shiur tonight. So we have a number of very interesting shilas and discussions. So after the shiur last Thursday evening, so at 1 o'clock in the morning, someone sent me this Ksav Yad Kodesh. It's an answer of the Rebbe to Rabbi Groner of Shalom. It was in connection with Tisha B'Av Tafshin Mem Hey. Tisha B'Av that year was the same kvias as this year, that Shabbos Tisha B'Av, and therefore it was delayed to Sunday. There were two things which were out of the ordinary, and Rabbi Groner asked the Rebbe about this. He had a certain responsibility of recording Chabad Minhagim, and he asked whether these changes were deliberate for posterity, or are they just temporary, just for this year. So the first thing was that in connection to Birkas Kohanim, and that is with the Chazan, that Shacharis will normally say after Moedim, before Sim Shalom, will say Alekeinu v'Alekei Avosseinu b'Orcheinu v'Avrocha HaMeshuleshes. The one who's davening at the Yom that day was Rabbi Binyamin Klein Olav Shalom. He had Yortzeit, and the Rebbe was very pronounced. The Rebbe's custom to look at the Chazan for Birkas Kohanim. We would turn 90 degrees, looking directly at the Chazan, and so though the general minhag is not to say Birkas Kohanim at Shacharis of Tisha B'Av, here the Rebbe seemed to expect that he should say Birkas Kohanim, which he probably did. And so then Rabbi Groner asked whether that is minhag kavua, or is that going to establish minhag, or is that just a one-off? So the Rebbe responded to him, it was Hiroas Shah. So there you can see, and this is the Rebbe's typical way of crossing out the word im, and then circling and underlining it is indeed Hiroas Shah. So that was the first thing. To this, the Rebbe then added a rationale, an explanation for saying Birkas Kohanim, and he says that's indeed the minhag HaMekabolim. This is the contemporary minhag HaMekabolim in Yerushalayim. Reb Amram Goen v'oid. So despite the common minhag not to say Birkas Kohanim at Shacharis, but the Rebbe is pointing to two or more strong sources of saying Birkas Kohanim at Shacharis on Tisha B'Av. The second point was that it came to Havdolo, and those who remember, there was an old elder bocher named Rabbi Yisrael Koziminsky, Olav Shalom. He was a bocher, and he usually would be the one to make Havdolo in 770. And here at Havdolo on Sunday night, the Rebbe kind of motioned to give the cup of wine to a child to drink. Now, to explain, during the 9 days, it's written in Shulchan Aruch, in Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, that the one who, when you make Havdolo, instead of drinking the wine, which you don't drink wine during the 9 days, so the wine is given to a child. Here, it's not during the 9 days, it's the day after. It's Motzei Tisha B'Av, and it's Motzei Tisha B'Av Nidcha. So here, however, the Rebbe still seemed to expect that they should give the cup of wine to a child. And here again, the minhag, the way it's recorded in the Luach Chayil Chabad, is that here you drink the wine yourself. And so, again, the Rebbe confirms, you can see here, Al Derech Zeh HaHiroah. So the Rebbe adds, as the word Shah, Hiroas Shah, but then he gives a whole list of reasons, or references, whatever, why it seems to make a lot of sense that the wine should have been given to a child. And he gives here one point. He says, he refers to l'chapes be'el yarabah, mashba beluach to Kaczynski ve'oid, kestimas l'shoin kol noise klei hashulchan. That seems to be the silent impression of the other commentators in Shulchan Aruch, levad hadogel mervava, with the exception of the dogel mervava, it's the comments of the Noda B'Yehuda on the margin of the Shulchan Aruch. Rayosim is esha lehuska befedish. The fact that he brings a proof, since it doesn't say that the Motzei Tisha, but you should give it to a child, is that you drink it yourself. After bepashtus nilmad zeh. Nilmad zeh mitzim tov kufrin aleph. Even though it's bepashtus, what's the difference whether it's Motzei Tisha B'Av or it's during the 9 days? My impression says that is that which he wants to differentiate between after Tisha B'Av, and especially as Rebbe Taryag points out that here it's a day later, the different distinction which the Dogam Levova makes, that no one mentions that no other than he, no other poskim mentioned that a Motzei Tisha B'Av that you can give you can drink the wine yourself. After Hapsak Din, even though there's a clear halocha, there also nishtas yain os that you're not allowed to drink wine on Motzei Tisha B'Av, as it says in Sofkov Tavkov Noches. So let's go through those things. As I said, I got this answer at 1 o'clock in the morning, and I was very, very excited about it. And so I spent some time, went to sleep, got in the morning. When the first thing in the morning, I started looking up these sources which the Rebbe had referred to about these two issues. So the first one was, if you remind you about, does the Chazan say Birkas Kohanim at Shacharis? Now here we have the Reb Amram Gaon. Reb Amram Gaon lived about 1,200 years ago or more. It's the earliest Siddur which we have, and closest to that is the Siddur of Sadia Gaon, which is later, and Ashkenazim generally follow Reb Amram Gaon. And here's at a time when they were still doing Birkas Kohanim every day, and as you know, that Mincha, even when they do Birkas Kohanim every day, you wouldn't do it on Mincha. The reason being that Mincha is after lunch. At lunch, people would have a glass of wine, and there would be a kohen maybe in chashash of shichrus, he maybe have drunk wine, is therefore disqualified. So at Mincha, one doesn't normally have Birkas Kohanim, with the exception of a fast day. So Rebbe Amram Gaon seems to be emphasizing that here, Birkas Kohanim is done at Mincha as well. But meanwhile, he says at Shacharis. So that's the earliest source of that Birkas Kohanim on Tisha B'Av. This is in the section about Tisha B'Av. Then the Rebbe said, the Minhag HaMekubolim be Yerushalayim Tibana V'Sekayim. That led me right away to the Kaf HaChaim, who very, very often records the Minhag of a Kehil in Yerushalayim called Beis Keil Yekabetz. And so, on the left of the screen, we've got the quote from the Kaf HaChaim, where he first quotes this minhag of not saying Birkas Kohanim. His earliest source, he gives a reference to the Abu Darham, one of the late Rishonim. Then he refers to the Shiur Knesset Agdola in his commentary on the Torah, and he gives a couple of reasons. One is that a Kohen who is in a year of Avelus, in a state of mourning, does not do Birkas Kohanim. And since Tisha B'Av, the Kohanim are, like all Yidden, are in a state of Avelus, therefore it's out of place to do Birkas Kohanim. The second reason he gives a quote from the Havdolo of Chazoin, where it says, when you spread out your palms, I will not pay heed. And so he takes this to understand that it means they're spreading out the palms of the Kohanim in Birkas Kohanim. Having said that, then the Kaf HaChaim says the Elya Rabba, who was a contemporary, I think, of the Baal Shem Tov around then, and so he says that the Minhag Ashkenaz in his country that they do say Birkas Kohanim at Shacharis on Tisha B'Av, and gives a reference to Sefer Shmuel, etc. And then he brings V'cheinu, he says, is the Minhag Beis Keil HaNizker, that community of Mekubolim, that they do say Birkas Kohanim at Shacharis too. That's because of the kavonis, in other words, the Kabbalah kavonis, that they apply on Tisha B'Av like any other day, and therefore they would not miss out Birkas Kohanim on Tisha B'Av morning. On the right of the screen, we've got a Dogel Mirvovo who gives another reason. It's not so happy with the reasons given for the minhag not to say Birkas Kohanim. It gives another reason because on Tisha B'Av one doesn't say Sholem, and in Birkas Kohanim it says Sholem, and therefore it's out of place. On the lower part of the screen, we've got here the Elia Rabo, who he says, as quoted in the Kafachayim, that it is said. So we have here different sources that to uphold the minhag of saying Birkas Kohanim at Shacharis, also on Tisha B'Av. So this is what the Rebbe is referring to in his answer, that minhag HaMekabolim, Reb Amram Goen v'oid. Okay. The second point was about Havdolo, about drinking wine at Havdolo. So you will remember that we discussed that according to the Ramban and other Rishonim, there's no Havdolo at all on a cup of wine after Tisha B'Av, not on Motzei Shabbos, not on Sunday night. And the Rosh disagrees, and he says on Sunday night you should do Havdolo, and that's what we have here in Shulchan Aruch Sof Kuf Nun Vav, Beleil Mitzvah Tisha B'Av, Mavdil ala Kois, but no bracha on a flame and no bracha on the B'Sam. Okay, so it says here you're meant to make Havdolo on a cup of wine. Then we have here the Maharil. Maharil is one of the late Rishonim, meaning Ashkenaz is built on the Maharil. And so here we have Minhogi Maharil. Motzei Tisha B'Av, Kesha Hechshich, when it came dark, Vistera Masuda, before having the meal, Mavdil Bala Bais Elakos, Beire Priagofen of Birkas Havdolo. So that confirms that the minhag is to make Havdolo on Motzei Tisha B'Av on a cup of wine, and like the Rosh and not like the Ramban. But who drank the wine? Does it say that the Maril would drink the wine, or would he give it to a child? And that's open for interpretation. So here we have the Elia Rabba, who brings the minhag Maril of drinking, of making Havdolo in a glass of wine. Venira de yitin latinik. If no, there's no tinnik. If there's no child, then you drink yourself. Whereas the Dogel Mervova here again, he quotes the same Maril, and he says he made a very bragofen. Idach mashma that he would drink mutal havdil ala yayin. It's mashma he would drink the wine himself. We don't have to give it to a child. During the 9 days, it says Daf Kuf Nun Aleph that Amos says to give the wine to a child. So he says Motzei Tisha B'Av Laila Zoi is more lenient. How do we see this? Because we see the Mogen Avraham in Tov Kuf Nun Ches. So here we have on the left the Mogen Avraham, and the Mogen Avraham is saying Motzei Tisha B'Av, where it says in Shulchan Aruch that you're not allowed to eat meat. Where it says here Vasurim Babosor. Sorry, no, that's not that. But it says in Shulchan Aruch that you're not allowed to eat meat Motzei Tisha B'Av. But if you have a Sudas mitzvah, then you're allowed to invite as many people as you want, not like on 9 days that you're limited just to have a minion eating fleishiks. And Morgan Avraham said, the Pshita, the Laila, it's obvious that this night of Motzei Tisha B'Av is more lenient than from Rosh Chodesh of during the 9 days. Because Motzei Tisha B'Av, you're allowed to have a haircut, you're allowed to do washing, do the laundry, and etc. You can even make a chasna. And therefore, although the minhag is not to have meat, but it's more lenient. You can, if you have a Sudas mitzvah, you can have as many as you want. So now the Dogel Levov is taking this one step further. All right, since you're allowed to have a Sudas mitzvah, you can also have the cup of wine for Havdolo. Very good. The question is then, why does the Mogen Avraham, when he brings these examples, why didn't he say also that you can you can drink the wine of Havdolo? So that's where the Rebbe is saying that although the Dogel Levov is saying, why is it not mentioned? And therefore he's assuming that you drink the wine yourself. But on the contrary, the fact that you can drink the wine yourself is not mentioned. And that itself is a proof that you shouldn't drink the wine yourself. All of this I found very, very interesting. Because as I mentioned last week, I was brought up that my father, Allah Shalom, would drink the wine himself, if you remember. as I told you last week. And here you have the Munketsche Rov in Darkei Chaim, is quoted in Darkei Chaim V'Sholem, that during the 9 days, he would make Havdolo and drink the wine, like any other Motzei Shabbos. He didn't make any distinction. So this seems to be a fairly prevalent minhag Chassidim, not only Chabad, to make Havdolo on a glass of, or to drink wine during the 9 days regardless. And here I'm seeing not only during the 9 days, but even after, where there's already a debate, that they're insisting on that it should be given to a child. What you have here now on this slide is taking it a bit further, the Hiskashrus journal. So he would, that's why I got my impression. He says, well, yeah, you're going to give the Shulchan says to give the wine to a child to drink. How old is this child? If the child is to be old enough to have chinuch for brochas, otherwise your brocha is not being used. So it has to be an old child. On the other hand, if the child is okay. So just to add to the pressure of not conforming with this minhag giving to a child, we have the Alter Rebbe in Siman Tzadik Hey, where he says, you know, in Ashkenazi shuls, every Friday night they make a kiddush. Who drinks the wine? Give it to a child. Why? Because the chazan who's making kiddush, he's not yotze from the kiddush, so therefore he can't drink the wine. So he gives it to a child. Usually gives it to a small child. Now here, by contrast, when it comes to Havdolo, so it says that the chazan makes Havdolo in Shul on a glass of wine, and then either he drinks himself, because if he's yotze, or he gives it to someone who is going to be yotze. But if he gives it to children, no one is yotze, because there's an emphasis that the wine for Havdolo has to be drunk by someone who is yotze mitzvahs Havdolo from this Havdolo. So now that makes it all the more. I mean, it's this child, see, who's it has to be a child who's at a chinuch on the level that he has to hear Havdolo. And then he goes on a story in Tafshin Lamed Ches that Saul Kazaminski started drinking the wine, and the Rebbe said to give it to a child, and then the Rebbe was very pleased, whatever. So here there seems to be a certain weight of not giving it to a child, because who says the child is going to be Yotze Havdolo, etc. And yet we see that the Rebbe was, as I said, was dafka pushing, as it says, the simple minhag Ashkenaz, that you give the wine to a child. One other interesting, I got a couple of feedbacks on this, and one of them was that Rabbi Broin, the Rav in Crown Heights, in his notes, he said not to give it to a girl, to give it dafka to a little boy. She's a Ketzanta word. Here the Alter Rebbe is saying you should give the wine, you can give the wine to someone who's yotze. So if you have a child who's old enough for chinuch for Havdolo, you can give him the wine. Now, according to the svara that noshim are pturis min Havdolo, so then the child, little girl, is not yotze Havdolo. It doesn't need to be yotze Havdolo. So there's no point in giving her the wine, because you have to give it to someone who's for sure being yotze mitzvahs Havdolo. It can be a child, higia lechinach Havdolo. Okay, that's as much as we have for this. And now we're going to go on to the next question. And okay, so here I had the following question. Someone last Friday, he calls me up, he's going and to a campsite with his family and is asking for Shabbos. Got called me on Friday, but he went on Sunday, or no, not Sunday, Monday, he went off to this campsite, and he asks me, what does he do about carrying on Shabbos in the campsite? So they'll have their tent with their family. So I asked, are there any other Yidden in the campsite? If there's no other Yidden, just one Yid and all the rest are Goyim, then there's no need for an Erev. You don't need to have an Erev with Goyim. As you can see here in Shi and Pei Base, where it says if you're with Goyim, there's no need for an Erev. When there are two Yidden, and then there is a need for an Erev, then if there's a Goy within that same complex, then it becomes a whole parsha of Shacharis Reshus, and it's a complicated geschäft, how you're going to sort that out. It can be sorted, but it's more complicated. So I said, listen, go there and look around if there are Bapashtas called the Ruba Parish, Ruba Parish. They're going to be all Goyim. But if there are other Yidden, then get back to me. We'll see what we can do about Shacharis Reshus to be able to make an Erev. The understanding is that the place is surrounded with a fence. So the mechitza is not the problem, it's just the Erev with the loaf of bread, etc. The problem which I had though was another one. And that we've discussed this before, the idea of karfif, that if you have an area which has got more than 100 amas by 50 amas, and it's not adjacent to a dwelling, that has got a din de rabbonon that you're not allowed to carry there. So here we have a hekev mechitzas, an enclosure which is not hukaf nadiras odom, it's not connected to a dwelling. That's called a karfif, and midrabon you're not allowed to carry more than 12 amas. So I never really had the pleasure of being in a campsite with all the flies and alazachen. So I don't know exactly, is there, if it's just a plain field, large field with plenty of space between one tent and the other, fine. So, but then it has a din of karfif. And if it's a karfif, you cannot carry that. Now, I think I've mentioned this before, that I once went through this topic in relation to about the encampment by the Oyel for Gimel Tammuz, where they take over a massive car park. There is a little bit more flexible. And that is based upon the following halacha, and that is in Shin Pei Base, I think this is, where it talks about people who are in a camp. They do have to have an Erev, unless they are a camp going la milchama. If they're going out to battle, then they are exempt of Erev and of Netilas Yadayim. Both are takonas Shlomo HaMelech. I don't know whether with any deeper connection, I'm sure there is, but Medvorim Amurim, when it's a machane kavua, which is there for several days. If it's, however, a shayora, a caravan, which is traveling, and they stop for Shabbos, so then they don't need to have an Erev, because they're just for Shabbos. So on this basis, that large encampment, although the people who came to the oil for Shabbos were not traveling, it wasn't a stop in the middle of a journey. They came for that purpose, but it was just for the one day. So perhaps one could use the concept of that they don't need to have an Erev, but the Erev is the easier thing to sort. Then we have here the shitta of some Rishonim to say, just like a shayora has got an exemption of Erev, the shayora has also got an exemption of the din of karf. All that would help if there would be only the campsite just for Shabbos. But if it's a camp for a whole week, so then we're back to the din of karfif. So I called the fellow yesterday and I asked him, tell me, is it possible that the camp's site is the grounds of a farmhouse? In which case, the enclosure is the lands affiliated, adjacent to a dwelling, and that would take away the whole din of karfif. If it isn't, if it's just a plain field, and there are all those tents there, then I really would be stuck to find a solution for this fella to be able to carry there without putting up his own special mechitzas. So someone is pointing out that some campsites have fixed caravans, but the problem with karfif is that the wall enclosing the karfif has to be more recent than the dwelling, and that's going to be difficult to start establishing when was the caravan put there, the permanent caravan, and when was the wall. If the wall is older than the caravan, then we still have a problem of karfif, which is a difficult one to solve. Okay, let's move on. Okay, for those who live in this part of the world, you may know that we have a ladies' shul at the back of the shul, and then we also have a gallery on the Mizrach wall overlooking from the front of the shul. What's the story for Birkas Kohanim? Do the women who are standing on that gallery behind the Kohanim, are they included in the Birkas Kohanim? May have been discussed, I'm sure I remember it has been discussed in the past, but on Tisha B'Av, I was relaxing and reading the memoirs of the late Rebbe Saul Jacobson. And here he writes, here you have it on the screen, he's describing how at some stage in Lubavitch, the big zal wasn't available for some reason, and so they had a smaller zal, and they had a small room on the Mizrach, where the Rebbe Rivka and the other women of the Beis Harav, they were in that room. So he says this room where the ladies of the Beis Harav would gather was on the Mizrach of this small shul, and therefore when it came to Birkas Kohanim on Yom Tov, so the women would go out of those Rebbetzins, would come out of that room, which was where they would regularly be, and instead they came round to the other side, to the west side of the small zal, and so that otherwise they wouldn't be ponim el ponim. So in case this has been forgotten about, there is an inyan of Birkas Kohanim should be ponim el ponim, and therefore those who are at the back, the front of the shul, would, if they wanted to be included in the bracha, they should lechatchila be preferable, if possible. They should come round just for Birkas Kohanim to the back of the shul to be able to be face to face to the Kohanim. Let's move on. Okay, I don't know whether he's online, but a friend of mine, had an old siddur or two, almost 200 years old, and he gave it to me. So it's on my shelf here, a siddur from printed, I think, Tov Kuf Pei Vov. And I had a mashulach come to the house, and he's looking around and he sees these antique Seforim, and he interested, yeah. And he says that he has a sideline or a main line, I don't know, but he handles an antique Seforim. And he asked me, am I interested to sell it? He says it's probably worth about £2,000. Okay. So I said, actually, I'm not into it. I'm not ready to consider it. And bichlal, I'm not so sure whether I'm allowed to sell Seforim just for the money. Baruch Hashem, I don't need the money. I'm not desperate. So that was the question. Then just this past week, someone asked me the very same question. Is there any hesitation about selling Seforim which you own? Not because you're desperate for the money. So here we have two quotes from Shulchan Aruch. One is from Yeridea, Siman Ayin Reish, and it's about the mitzvah of Ksiva Sefer Torah. We all know the shit of the Rosh, who says that the mitzvah of Ksiva Sefer Torah is now fulfilled by having Chumoshim and Mishnayos and Gemaras. That's how we fulfill the mitzvah of having a Sefer Torah, because the mitzvah of Ksiva Sefer Torah is to be able to learn Torah. So now here we have a quote from the Rosh. Ha'idna mitzvah lichtov chumshei haTorah u'mishna u'gemara u'perushem. Then he adds, if you have these Seforim, you should not sell them unless you need the money either to be able to advance your learning of Torah or to be able to get married. So here we see it very clear in Shulchan Aruch. It's not so straightforward to sell Seforim estamazoi. That's in Siman Ayin Reish Yeredei. Siman Kuf Nun Gimel and Erech Chaim, Dinim of Beis HaKnesses, talking about selling of a shul, and talks about the buyer, you have to talk about a village, so they have more control to be allowed to sell the shul, unless for certain purposes, which are disgraceful purposes. Now, then Sif Yud says, Yesh oimim de yochid v'sheloi. The yochid's got a private, sacred object, even a Sefer Torah. He may sell it and use the money for whatever he wishes. Yesh misha oiser elim kein lilmed Torah elisa isha. There are those who say, no, you're not allowed to sell Seforim unless it is for the purpose of using the money to be able to advance your learning of Torah or someone's learning of Torah or to be able to get married. In the Dirshu edition of the Mishnah Brura, in Erech Chaim Kuf Nun Gimel, quotes Reb Moshe Feinstein, person who's got doubles of certain of various Seforim. So Reb Moshe says he is allowed to sell them. I apologize, I didn't get around to looking up the Birkas Moshe inside. He then quotes from the Sefer Pele Yoyitz, which says a person shouldn't sell Seforim of their personal use, personal collection, even if they have numerous copies. And he quotes this from the Sefer Hasidim, so on the Rishonim, Yehuda Chosid, where he says, Ma'aseh be'echad. There was a person who had he had a spare Sefer HaZoyar, and he sold it. And in his dream, he was told, you are a behemoth, because the word behemoth, the Rosh Tevis, bi'arti hakodesh min habayis. I have the word exterminated the sacred from my house. So here we're seeing quite strong language. As I'm reading this, I'm curious how come that the Zohar is mentioned in Sefer Chassidim, because as far as I understood, the Zohar was only known in kind of later years. Look up the history on that. Let's move on. So in other words, the earlier Rishonim for sure don't mention the Zohar. It's right. Let's move on. Okay, so here is a shaila. The location has been deliberately erased. So I've got the shaila here about making an eruv. This is a Beis Chabad, and they've got here. This is the building which belongs to Chabad, and they have a grounds a bit further over here, and they want to pull a string from this pole on top of this veranda. And here there's a signpost of sorts, which is held up by posts. So they want to connect, make an eruv from here to here, and then somehow to extend it. The only hesitation I had was, now, although it's more than 10 amos, don't worry about it, because the other three sides of that enclosure have got normal fences, solid fences. So therefore, that chumrah of the Alter Rebbe of not having a Psuras HaPesach more than 10 amos wide is talking about when it's in multiple sides. But if it's just on the one side, that's acceptable. The only question I had was the string. I know that the red string goes in front of the tree, but in reality, it would have to go through the tree. Does the tree disrupt the eruv? That was the question. And I had read about this in I remember seeing discussion about this, but I'm seeing now in contemporary Seforim that they talk about trees in the way in the way of the eruv, and they're only concerned. This is a sefer called Tikkun Eruvin. Is concerned if the tree kind of distorts the wire. But if the wire is going straight, the fact there's a tree in the way shouldn't, as far as I can find. Someone can correct me. So it's not a problem. Yeah, my brother is pointing out that behemoth is also Rosh Hashanah Baruch Haba Melech HaMashiach. Okay, Fine. Let's move on. Thank you. It's always good to have something humorous. Okay, here we go. The next question. Eggs. These eggs are unusual in shape, in that the eggs are usually more round at one end and more pointy at the other end. The expression in Shulchan is kad and chad. Chad meaning sharp, pointy, and kad means round like a barrel. And they're three separate eggs. But someone's out on holidays, obviously, and picked up these eggs. And he asked me, are they okay or not? And well, here you go. Simon Pei Vov in Yedidea. Simone Beitsim Lahakir Sheheim Me'ov Tahir, to know whether the eggs are from a kosher bird, a kosher species. Im Shnei Rosheh Kadin, if both of the ends are roundish, or if both ends are more pointy, if the yolk, the yellow stuff is the outer, and the albumin, the white, is on the inner, those are all simonim that it's from a beas oif tome, from a non-kosher species. Even if the moicher says it's from a that's from oif toher, we cannot rely on it. If one end is round and the other one is pointy, then you know it's a kosher bird, a kosher bird. So here we go. It's interesting, very, very interesting. Wouldn't expect to find that in a regular batch of eggs, but it looks so. I told him you can't use it. Yeah. He said to me that the one who sent them to this picture to me, he said it looks like some people keep ornamental birds, and they have these interesting different types of eggs. Components, not okay. Yes, another question came through this past week. A room which is not in use at all. Sometimes people have a larger house, and there's a room which is not in use at all. Doesn't need to have a mezuzah. Now, I don't have a clear source for this, but my impression is that it does not need to have a mezuzah. Here we have, this is from the Chayodom, but he writes in his Lashon, mezuzah's chayvas hador, shem yesh li bayis ve'ein dor boy. If I own a dwelling, but I don't live there, it's an empty dwelling, to pot in mezuzah, I'm taking this further, even if it's in a house, and that room is totally unused, and there's no intention of using it even once a year. So then that room would be part of mezuzah. That's as much as I could find. We go on to the next point. Okay. So last Thursday I was at the Siyum in the yeshiva, and someone came over to me and asked me what's the background for the Chabad minhag of the way we do our ritzuos. Now, not like this picture. The typical Chabad minhag is where the Rebbe was nohig. That would be the first ritzua on the lower arm, small gap, then the next two, and then the four. So, although what's normally written is the 3 and the 4 are separated, that's also a Chabad minhag of 3 and the 4. That already we have on record from the Rebbe Rashab. But here we have the Rebbe was nohig like a bit of a gap between the first and the second two. So curious, where does it come from? At the time I did it, I said I don't know. I'll try to do some research. And what I'm saying is now going to be just is storage called using? Going back to the previous question, I think the answer is yes. Storage, which is like the overflow of the house, that's also considered part of the house. Yes. Let's come back to the tefillin then. Okay. So in the Sefer Ashkavta de Rebbe, he wants to suggest that the 3 and the 4 is reminiscent of, like you have on the Shalrosh, the 3-head shin and the 4-head shin, and they are, this is mentioned in Redi Bes Yosef, you got the regular writing, a shin is made with 4 lines. Sorry, the shin is made with 3 lines, like Sav the Sefer Torah. The luchas, because it's the carving, so 4 lines would have between them 3 spaces. So looking over here, the 4 straps with 3 spaces is reminiscent of the ksav on the luchas. That's what the Ashkafta Rav Rivkin writes. But meanwhile, coming back to our question, most Yidden today are known to have 7 straps, but in Chabad there's this 1 and 2, and then the 4. Where's it come from? And the best I could find is the following. The Bes Yosef writes, in earlier sources, there's no clear mention of how many times to go around the arm. In Gemara, there's no mention at all. How many of going around the arm? If you get the impression, you can even go straight from the upper arm straight to your hand. But the minig is to go around the arm. Bes Yosef says, either 6 times or 7 times. So then we have from the Arizal to do 7 times. The Munkacherov in Oischaim V'Sholem, he wants to say the following, that the Shisho Ishivo is not a contradiction. There's a question when you do the first strap here. Now, the first strap is only half. It's only the upper half of that circuit. The first half is on the upper half on the upper arm. So you have really, what you're seeing here, 7 is only 6.5. So he wants to say the Shisho Ishivo, you can look at it as 6, you can look at it as 7. See, that's what the Bes Yosef means. He doesn't mean to have 6 circuits. He means 7, which can be, perhaps in truth, only 6. So having said that there is an inyan of 6, as well as there's an inyan of 7, so possibly that's what the Rebbe's kavana of having the first one separate, because there seems to be shisha or shiva. So by having a bit of a gap, so we have our shisha is clear, and then if you want, you will count the other one as shiva. I don't remember who. Someone mentioned to me that he was once looking at the Rebbe, and it looks like the Rebbe had actually an extra circuit, like an 8th circuit around the arm, and he was wondering, and as if the Rebbe had read his machshavas, and the Rebbe stopped, counted, put his finger, counted 7. Yeah, it's good. We continue. Okay, let's move on. Fine. So now, someone asked me, one of our listeners in the United States, asks me, he learns Tanya with the Yidden, and in Tanya Perik Tezayin talks about the importance of kavona of mitzvahs, and kavona ava v'yireh, and the ava v'yireh are compared to the wings, like a bird is kosher without wings. Nitlu agapeo is kosher, but without the wings, the bird can't fly. So too, a mitzvah without kavana, without ava v'yireh is also a mitzvah. It's a kosher bird, but it doesn't have the elevation, doesn't have the propellers to be elevated. The propellers are ava v'yireh, the chilu orchimu. Chilu orchimu is Aramaic for yireh and ava, for fear and love of Hashem. So he's asking, if it's such an important thing to have ava v'yireh, when you're doing mitzvahs, why then does the Alter Rebbe take out, not have the l'shem yichud in his siddur? Specifically, before putting on the talis, it mentions in the other siddurim, Nusach Sfard, l'shem yichud kutshabrichu, and he mentions bitchilu ruchimu has a nusach of l'shem yichud, and that's I'm not the expert on all the Nusach Sfard of the l'shem yichuds, but I think this is quite consistent to have bitchilu ruchimu in most of the l'shem yichuds at least. Kopon is asking why it's not there. So here's a very interesting thing, a very interesting perspective. Again, I'm going back to my my reading the memoirs of Rebbe Saul Jacobson. Saul Jacobson was born or brought up in a town called Juravitz. And he says that when he was a young boy in Juravitz, there was 2 shuls, one daven Nusach Ashkenaz and one daven Nusach Ari. but there was no Chassidischkeit. There was no Varmkeit of not the whole. It was just a nusach. It wasn't anything more. To the point, he says that the mikveh in Juravitz, on Friday it was warm because people would go to the bathhouse Friday, so they used the mikveh also. But Shabbos morning was cold. It was like people that were davening this nusach, but they weren't inspired at all with limud chassidus at all. And probably this was true in many towns in Russia. I remember reading years ago from Rabbi Saul Jacobson's memoirs, which were published in the Yiddish Shehem, that there were in New York 80 nusach harishuls. But all these people, immigrants, coming from Russia, and they davened nusach harish, so they made nusach harishul, but they weren't chassidim in the inspired sense. They were, as the Friedrich Rebbe used to call them, chassidei hanusach. And really, it raises a very interesting question. What's the pshat of this? What's the pshat of changing people's nusach, and they're going to be chassidim just in nusach, nothing else? They're not chassidim in any other active sense. What's the value in it? So, in the Rebbe's sichos, there's two landmark sichos about the Alter Rebbe's Siddur. One of them is about Sfiras Oimer, and it's the Chelik Chov Beis. The other one is the Chelik Lamed Tes, where it talks about preparing yourself for Tchiyas Shofar. And the Rebbe talks about the Alter Rebbe's plan in creating this Siddur. So, Behekdim Inyan Kololi of the Alter Rebbe's Siddur. Although the Nusach was in line with Kavonas Arizal, in addition to the Alter Rebbe's effort that it should be correct, al pi diktuk vehaloshim, which is an interesting point. Hadiktuk vehaloshim, these are two separate things. Grammatically correct, as in vowels and all that, and then also perhaps an expression. So the Alter Rebbe made enormous effort in those. However, he deliberately did not quote about 6 or 7 places where there are Kabbalah stuff in the Siddur, but generally he left it all out. Because those Kabbalah focuses are not relevant for across the board. And I tell you this bit of history. The Shovel L'chol Nefesh just took on, from reading Rabbi Jacobson's memoirs, takes on a new level. People who are just very simple people who are just can manage Siddur. They're not managing to learn Chumash even. But they daven a Siddur. And the Alter Rebbe wanted that they should daven Nusach Hari. So what's the svara here? So Bichlal Mashma, generally we understand the Kavonas, Kabbalah, this is for Yechidas Gula. Aval Yoisenir. Now let's read it carefully. That the fact that Alter Rebbe established this Nusach HaTfilah, and Shovel L'chol Nefesh, and it's aligned with the Kavonas Arizal, Hu Lefisha Yedei Etzem HaTfilah B'Nusach Zeh, the fact that you'll daven with this Nusach, even though you don't understand anything about the Kavonas, by davening this Nusach, it is Nif'olim, you're achieving all the Amshochas and Kavonas Arizal. It's almost like, perhaps he even mentions elsewhere in this Sikha about the Gavra Chefza. The Chefza of this Siddur is aligned with the Kavonas Arizal. And therefore, as simple and unlettered in Kabbalah as you may be, but by using this Siddur, you are associated with the Kavonas Arizal. So that's a whole very interesting plan here, a strategy that the Alter Rebbe wanted, that even Poshet Yidden, when it shaykhs to any inspiration of Chassidus, they should, however, be connected through davening such a Siddur with the Arizal, with the Kavonas Arizal. I think I mentioned before that the Mizritche Maggid in his last few months, he had a visitor, a newcomer, and his name was Yisrael Hopstein, otherwise known as the Koznitzer Maggid. And he had a reputation that he was Boki in 600 Sifrei Kabbalah or something fantastic. And at that time, the Arizal Siddur had never been published. It was just in manuscript. And the Alter Rebbe was a young man, and he was in attendance with the Maggid, who was very frail at the time. And the Alter Rebbe, the Maggid says, the Zritcher Maggid says, was Ken Magia sein, the Siddur Arizal. He looked at the Koznitzer Maggid as being capable of checking through this Siddur or Arizal manuscript, which we have. This we have. I've seen manuscripts, copies of this Siddur. It exists today. But before this conversation, the Maggid asks the Koznitzer. He says, "Where for van bist du?" So he says, "From Koznitz." Wo is Koznitz? So he says, "It's nicht weit von Warsche." Ah, it's a suburb of Warsche. Oh, is jetzt, es kann mir hoffen, als halbe von Warsche, mit onheben sagen, Kesser anstatt Naritzach. He saw an opportunity that he will be able to change the Nusach in Warsche, instead of Naritzach for Musaf, they'll say Kesser. So again, he's saying, what's he looking at? He's talking about hundreds of thousands of Yidden. Most of them were probably, many of them for sure, were not very learned, and still the Maggid saw here a purpose, a strategy. And the Frierdiker Rebbe, just to finish off on that point, the Frierdiker Rebbe exploited the Chassidic HaNusach concept. And he says, you're Shacharis to Nusach, that means you're Shacharis to Chabad. Okay, so then we can take it further. So there's an interesting strategy here. Possibly in some situations where, because he is affiliated, just done this Nusach, but you connect it, let's take it further. Let's take one last point, and that is that I got a little bit of pushback from the United States about last week's lashing out about going to sports stadiums, being all I did, I quoted the Rashi where he says it's stadiois v'karkasois. So just I pointed out that Rashi, and all right, a little bit more, but fine. So then I mentioned Moshe Feinstein, who in Igros Moshe, who doesn't see the sports stadiums as anything to do with the religion, and therefore it's just Moshe Leitzim. He doesn't go for it. He's also criticizing. He just says it's Moshe Leitzim because to be Chukiseyim, it has to be something which has got some religious background. So I mentioned this briefly last week. So someone writes to me that actually, if you look in the Roman or Greek history, you see that the stadiums and the amphitheaters, they were part of their religious, they had a religious element also. And the separation of religion from other parts of society is a relatively recent innovation. Okay, so which I said to him, so he was trying to, I guess, defend the attendance at these sports things. And I said, actually, just it proves the point to the contrary. You're telling me that sports stadiums have their origins in some degree of pagan practice. Now, there's here a fascinating piece in Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch in Siman Beis. Siman Beis, the Alter Rebbe wrote those. We have two versions of that. This is Madura Basra. And the Alter Rebbe talks about sitting bareheaded. So he starts off in saying, Midach Sidus is you don't walk Dal Damas bareheaded. And then he says, V'yachshav bisman hazeh. Nowadays, that everyone, all Yidden, I guess, are accustomed to cover their heads. You're not allowed to walk or even sit bareheaded, mishum tznius, because it's a part which is normally covered. And children also should have their head covered. The kol shekain b'medinas elu, shehanochrim nahagul legalis leisha. and the goyim would come into the house off with their hat right away. It's disrespectful to sit in the house with your hat on. You have to take off your hat out of respect. Yisraelim kedoshim nizhorim b'zeh mishum tznius. And Eden are particular to keep their head covered. If so, if you go bareheaded, if you sit bareheaded, now this seems to suggest, as I said, the rule is because it's got a religious background. So why is the minhag of going to bare their heads, has that got a religious background? So I looked for it today, I can't find it, but I remember years ago seeing in the Sdei Chemed that the minhag of Nochrim to bare their heads is because they want to say, when I was a baby, I was taken to the Tumah and they spritzed some schmutzige water on my head, and therefore he's bearing his head to reminiscent of his being baptized. So the bearing of their head has got a religious background. Once it's got a religious background, so then it falls into the category of chukes hagoy, and emulating would be also under chukesein leisalecho. So now if you're telling me that stadiums have got their origins in some kind of pagan practice, whether it's in Greece or whatever it may be, but you're saying it's got a pagan background, well, that's all the more reason to say what Rashi says, that Eilutz Tadyois is included in Chukesein Leiselechu. And just to finish off, if we go another minute, no, it's not even over time, but tonight is going into Chamisha Osa B'Ov, and it's a time where Kol HaMoishif Moisifin Loi. Now the nights are getting a little bit longer, and so we have more time for learning Torah at night. And so Kol HaMoisif Moisifin Loi, go greater and stronger and more in the Yedias HaTorah, Kiyam HaMitzvahs, a Guten Shabbos, and Simchas Olam Al Resham. Kol Tov.
Shkach, good Shabbos.
Shabbos.